I remember when I first started to assess my students, I thought it was all about how much my students know about the subject, until I figured out that's part of the whole thing called assessment. Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today I'll tell you about assessment. Still asked in every teacher interview, how do you assess your students? Well, let's get into this in today's video. As far as we all know, there are two main types of assessment: formal assessment and informal assessment. Formal assessment is where you assess your students through a test or an exam to give them a score. But the informal assessment is entirely different because it happens between you and your students into the classroom while working on the classroom activities you prepared ahead. Well, in today's video, I'll be focusing more on the informal assessment, and the formal assessment will be in a separate video. Well, so let's see what we should know about the informal assessment in very simple points. So first of all, informal assessment happens on a day-to-day basis. And that means when you get into your classroom, like every single day, you observe your students while working on the classroom activities. You observe how well they're working together, how well they're interacting with you, with one another, how well and how much they're involved in like questioning, pair work, group work, project work, etc. Okay? How much and how well they're motivated towards learning. And at the same time, you interact with your students, commenting on their work to give them feedback. And this feedback is useful to their learning, which is why it must be given in a very useful way, in a productive and positive way. Good job. Well done. It's okay, but it needs 1, 2, 3. How about this instead of that? Oh, would rather say this, and so on, Whatever your kind of feedback, your feedback should be given in a very positive way to help your students improve their learning. That will take you to another kind of feedback, the feedback from the teacher to HOD, supervisor, or students' parents about your students' performance. So the whole process of informal assessment happens daily. Every day you observe an individual student or a group of students or the whole class. Well, move on to how important is informal assessment. Actually, informal assessment is way too important for many, many reasons. I mentioned 3 of them. Well, 1, as long as informal assessment is happening, the whole learning process is active into the classroom. Active learning. And by the way, I have a video about active learning, and it was a year ago. Anyway, I want to say the environment of active learning is what you need to informally assess your students. Number 2, informal assessment supports formal assessment. The testing system or grading your students all the time is not the only way to track their performance, to track their learning, Assessment merely means you make judgments about your students' learning by observing while working into the classroom and testing their abilities or knowledge or skills, whatever, So you need the 2 sides of the same coin. Number 3 is way too important. Informal assessment is formative. Formative assessment, or formative, literally means to form something undeveloped yet. So informal assessment happens from the beginning of the course, throughout the course, to form students' learning and teachers' teaching. To form students' learning means to develop the learning, to make sure it's in progress all the time. And the whole thing here happens at the stage of observing your students while working into the classroom, commenting to get them feedback to help improve their learning. So informal assessment forms students' learning. Well, the other part is to form teachers' teaching, and that means your teaching style, the approaches you use into the classroom, your strategies, the resources or materials you go for, you evolve all that kind of stuff and more depending on your students' interaction into the classroom, which is why informal assessment helps you too to form your teaching. Well, last but not least, informal assessment types. Since informal assessment can be carried out by students too, there's 2 main types of informal assessment: self-assessment and peer assessment. Self-assessment, students can assess themselves in a specific area you decide through a particular form you create. For example, students are going to assess themselves in writing an essay. So this form could include some rubrics about writing an essay, like, for example, I can form sentences correctly. I can get ideas easily, I can join ideas properly, or I'm good at punctuating, etc. Okay, so students are going to check these rubrics and check if yes or no or not sure, or green, red, yellow. Anyway, before doing that thing, make sure that your students are aware of the whole idea. But peer assessment, students can assess one another. Like, for example, they can look at the pieces of writing of one another, or they can write some comments in the portfolios of each other. And by the way, portfolios are also useful for self-assessment, whereas the owner of the portfolio can write some comments on their work too. So anyway, you're going to use self-assessment or peer assessment depending on your time management, classroom management, the flexibility into the classroom, or your students' presence, and so on, you know? So the whole thing depends on you and your students. So that's it for today's video. Informal assessment is really simple and basic. In short, you can say like informal assessment is to observe your students, to give them feedback, to form their learning, and to feed your future lessons, which is why it's formative. Thanks for watching anyway. Please hit the subscribe button if you're interested in more videos about teaching methodologies, and see you in a new video.